Hey everyone, it's Fox. Welcome back to my channel, and for today's video, I'm going to be showing you all how I made these Mandalorian pauldrons, shoulder pieces, whatever you want to call them, for my husband's Mandalorian armor, as well as show you all of the mistakes that I made along the way, and there were many. Shout out to my Patreon supporters for your generous support of my work and my content, and if you would like to see your name up here as well, you can do that by heading over to patreon.com/Fox. I've got some cool rewards like access to my Discord server, as well as some behind the scenes content and early access to my videos, as well as stickers, which I'm really excited to get out to you guys. And with that, let's get onto the tutorial. Like the previous Mandalorian videos that I've made, I will be using Galactic Armory's STL files. I ended up printing out both of these at 100% scale with a 0.28mm layer height, and each pauldron took about 19 to 20 hours to print in total. If you're looking for some help on how to scale your 3D files, I recommend checking out these two tutorials where I use Mesh Mixer to measure and scale files to my husband's measurements. After both of my shoulders were finished printing, I removed all the supports with my hands and some plastic clippers. I then took my soldering iron and melted down any remaining supports on the bottom of the models. Once they were all cleaned up, it was time to get rid of all of these layer lines, and for that, like in my previous videos, I use photopolymer resin. By now, you've heard me talk about why I no longer use UV resin. And this video, depending on how you look at it, actually might help you to understand why it's one of the more difficult methods to actually use, or it might help you avoid making these mistakes altogether, because boy did I make mistakes on these shoulder pieces. My first mistake was applying this UV resin out in my garage with the door open. As you can tell in this footage, there's definitely sunlight getting in there, even though I'm in the shade. The reason that this was a mistake is because UV resin, like the name implies, begins to cure whenever it's exposed to ultraviolet light, also known as the kind of light that the sun gives off, or at least one of the types of light that the sun gives off. I'm not a scientist. So basically, whenever I brushed the resin on in the sun, it cured wherever I put it, so I didn't have time to actually smooth out that layer. UV resin does not self-level, so you kind of have to get a really nice thin coat on your own. This left me with an uneven layer of resin that I was convinced that I could sand down and fix, and well, we probably already know how that goes. After that first coat of resin was down, I let the pieces cure in the sun for 15 minutes, even though the resin was basically already cured by the time it was out in the sun, and I brought them inside and wiped them down with some 91% isopropyl alcohol. After that, I began the sanding process with some 120 grit sandpaper. The sanding process was, honestly, no pun intended, pretty rough. It wasn't sanding as nicely as other pieces I'd worked on, and the sandpaper was gumming up super quick. Like, I went through about 4 sandpaper pads on this one shoulder piece alone. I now know, looking back, that this was because the resin wasn't completely cured due to how I was applying it in that indirect UV light. So if you're going to use this UV resin, then make sure to shut your windows and blinds and the garage door, and just make sure that there's no ambient UV light anywhere that could be potentially near where you're going to be using this resin. So after messing up that first layer, I basically spent the rest of my time with these shoulder pieces fixing my mistakes. I didn't want to apply any more resin as I had already messed things up pretty bad, so I started off by applying a layer of 2-in-1 filler primer onto this sanded down resin. Once that was dry, I then applied some Bondo to fill in those lower spots and scratches on the shoulder that were caused by the uneven resin layer. The shoulder with the mudhorn sigil, I ended up just like completely covering in Bondo because it was truly just wrecked and needed a lot of help. I know, you're probably laughing and just yelling at me from behind your keyboard at how stupid I was, but here's the thing. I figured it out so you don't have to mess it up, so at least now you know and you won't do this. So once that Bondo layer was dry, I went back in with my mouse sander and sanded it down with some 120 grit sandpaper. You can really tell how old this footage is because I was in shorts, and right now I'm snuggled in my basement with the heat turned up to 72. Once the Bondo was sanded down to my liking, I again gave both pieces a coat of 2-in-1 filler primer, and at this point I just alternated back and forth between giving it a coat of Bondo, sanding it down, and giving it another coat of filler primer until it was smooth enough for me to start wet sanding. I started with 220 grit sandpaper and worked my way up to 500, though you could really go to higher grits if you wanted to. I didn't feel the need to do that only because I knew that the 2K clear coat I'd be using later on the process would be enough to smooth out any of my mistakes. And I had a lot of them. Have I mentioned how many times I made a mistake on this? I gave everything one final coat of 2-in-1 filler primer before giving both shoulder pieces a coat of Montana Gold Shock Black as a base coat. After After letting that base coat cure for 24 hours, I went in with some 2K clear coat to give these pieces a glossy finish on which we'll apply our chrome onto later. I go into more detail on this 2K clear coat process in this video here, if you'd like to learn more about how to use it and some tips and tricks I picked up trying it out for the first time. This clear coat needs about 72 hours before it can be handled safely, but man, I really can't get over how just smooth and glossy it leaves these pieces. You really can't even tell the amount of grief that I had to get to this point. With our clear coat cured, it's finally time to spray on some chrome. For that, I'm using my airbrush and all clad chrome. Make sure that you wear a respirator when spraying with this paint and spray 6 to 8 inches away from your piece in short bursts from side to side, otherwise known as not what I'm doing on the screen. I was going in small circles, and while it does work, it also can cause some issues in your paint job. Like it can create some spider webbing and small splatters to occur in your airbrush, which you really don't want in a paint job meant to replicate Beskar. Once I was happy with the application, I then let those pieces dry and fully cure for a full 24 hours. And just for reference, I used a 4-ounce bottle of all clad chrome, and I had like maybe that much left in the bottle, and that's for all of the armor on Din Djarin's costume. I definitely didn't put that much paint on just the shoulder pieces alone, it was for the entire costume. Now while this coat is drying, make sure to go and clean out your airbrush thoroughly with lacquer thinner, as all clad chrome is a lacquer based paint and it can't be broken down by traditional soaps and airbrush cleaners. Trust me, I broke an airbrush this way and I am not making that mistake again. The final step for these shoulders was to apply a clear coat to the chrome, and this is where I yet again tell you that what I did didn't work. I used all clad's glossy clear coat and sprayed on 2 thin layers, but what I think it really needed was a 3rd thick coat to seal things in. These pieces, along with a few others on the costume, ended up getting a bit scratched and dinged up, and that's how I knew that the clear coat didn't protect it from much of anything. I am kicking around the idea of, you know, maybe wet sanding it down and reapplying the chrome over top of it, but I'm not entirely sure the best way to go about that, but it is an idea for a future video. So if you have any like recommendations on how I could, you know, potentially sand this down and paint it back over chrome again, then let me know down below. But again, other people have had success with this type of clear coat, so it really was user error on my part, so you might have better results than I did. For attaching these shoulders to the flight suit, all I did was get some Velcro and glue that on with some E6000 glue. I would recommend applying the Velcro before you do your paint job so you don't have to worry about clamping the Velcro in place. For me, I had to carefully balance the pieces on some type of microfiber towel and weigh it down with a 1-2-3 block. And that's all that there was to it, to getting these 2 prints off the printer and ready to wear. These shoulder pieces, through no fault other than my own, were the most difficult pieces to finish on this costume. But hopefully by seeing me struggle bust my way through this build, then you will learn from my mistakes and not make them in your own build. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching and for always being so cool about me sharing my mistakes on this channel. Sometimes it's a little bit, I don't know, I get a little bit worried that I put out a video tutorial and I'm basically like, ha, I messed this up. Don't do this. It's like, it's not a very good tutorial, but I really appreciate that you guys let me kind of share my misgivings and the things that I screw up over here. So greatly appreciate it. And as always, I will catch you guys next time. Bye!